everyone. I'd just like to start by congratulating Bob. I'm sure on behalf of all of us, I'd be giving him an A++, I think, Rishi, to be honest. So, Bob, thank you for that fantastic insight. And I have the job of following that. But look, I think a lot of the themes that Bob and indeed Tansy picked up on in their remarks really resonate with what we're about to talk about here, because the Randox Grand National is probably, if I could get this to work, that'd be great. Yeah, there we go. The Randox Grand National, I think we'd all agree, is probably one of the key proof points, one of the key instances when our social license as a sport is, if you like, on the line. It's our one event of the year, even above the likes of the Cheltenham Festival, Royal Ascot, the Derby, where we really, really cut through as a sport to the general public. And of course, that's a massive opportunity for us, because that gives us the platform to tell our story as a sport. And what a brilliant story as a sport I think we have to tell, not just around welfare, but around so many other proof points of how racing contributes positively to society. And that day when we're in the sporting spotlight, like no other time, is our chance to do that. But equally, as we all know, this race is our highest risk race, our highest risk event when it comes to potential things, the things that can go wrong. We were on a podcast when we announced these changes called When It Hits the Fan. Well, when the Grand National is on, when the Randox Grand National is on, we know at the Jockey Club that's when it really can hit the fan, and obviously we're very, very prepared for that and all eventualities, as you would imagine. But I think that using this race and showing we've got proof points as to how we're changing this race, and we're making this race as safe as it can possibly be, whilst preserving its uniqueness, is one of our biggest strategic objectives as a sport. Because if we're going to use that opportunity, we've got to be able to tell the story, to use some of Bob's themes, on how we are taking proactive action to move the race forward in a way that is acceptable. Tansy laid us down a challenge in her speech at the start. What happens and what was acceptable to previous generations is not going to be acceptable going forward. And she's absolutely right, and that is the context in which everything we do when we think about equine welfare generally at the Jockey Club and across racing should be framed. So that's the context in which we started to think about how do we evolve this race. And the big thing to remember, this isn't working again. There we go. The big thing to remember, of course, is that we've got an opportunity to really tell our story, but also we are evolving the race all the time. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the historic evolution of the race. It's not the same race it was in the 70s. It can't be. But look at other sports. You look at Formula One, the halo, those little funny bits of metal they've got in front of the driver in the car now. Look at we don't see FA Cup replays on muddy pitches anymore. Pity that, but you don't. You don't see rugby players coming back onto the field with bloodied heads anymore and headbands like you used to in those Six Nations games from the 70s and 80s. Sport is changing, sport is evolving, and sport is evolving because society's expectations of sport are changing, and the Grand National is right in the centre of that, and that's what we as a sport need to accept the challenge for, realise and act and be able to tell our story accordingly, whilst in this case maintaining the uniqueness of this wonderful race, so it becomes a true differentiating factor of the sport and something that people want to continue to engage with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our overall sort of welfare objectives, a big part of our strategy for the Jockey Club. And then I'll get into some of the public perception issues and things we were facing in thinking about how we evolve and change the race. And there are some really interesting proof points I'm going to show you around that. Then I'll get into the changes themselves. And then we'll talk a little bit at the end about sort of the media strategy and how that landed. There are a couple of videos. Hopefully they will work. The slides are not my friend at the minute, but hopefully that will change. Very briefly, we at the Jockey Club are operating a number of our biggest jumps events. So when I got this job, I was very clear in my own mind that equine welfare was something that needed to run through the heart of absolutely everything we do. And that doesn't just mean in terms of how we invest in it. We've invested $2 million at entry alone in welfare changes the last few years. We have a ring-fenced budget for welfare investments every year, and that's everything from track setup to hurdles to the way the ground is set up. There are people in our business in the room far more technically qualified than me to talk about that. But it runs absolutely through the heart of everything we do because it is fundamental to the long-term sustainability of the sport. And our passion and our commitment to that runs deep. And I think the proof points are there to show that that will continue and that will always be something that we value and we have right at the center of everything we do. And then being able to tell the story, which I'll come on to, because as a sport, there have been times in the past where I think we've not been overt enough about telling this story, and we have a great story to tell. And if we take one thing from Bob's session this morning, it's that we've got to be out there talking positively about that story, and the Grand National is the platform in which to do that. But our changes here are very much framed in the context of our wider strategy around welfare and the oversight we have of that. Quick one on some stats. There are more stats in this presentation later on. When we measure welfare outcomes, we think about what's called FUBs. So very familiar to a lot of people in this room. Fallers on seats brought downs, which are likely to lead and can lead in some cases to fatalities. Our 3-year rolling impact on that, because of the changes we've made, the investments we've made, we've gone from about 2.45% rolling on the left there to 2014 to 16 to more recently down around 1.95, 1.94%. Now, interestingly, within those numbers, jumps started off at around, in the start of the period, around 5.5, 5.6%. It's come down to 4.1%. Flat, it's barely moved. It's about 0.26, 0.27%. So I think that's not to say there isn't more we can't do on the flat. There's always more we can do. But there comes a point at which, as my maths teacher would have said, the curve tends to zero. But I think what those numbers show you is that on jumps racing, it will never be equalised with flat racing in terms of FUBs for pretty obvious reasons, but we still have a long way to go and a lot more we can do. But we have also come a long way, and I think this is one of the proof points we use, along with the fact that the fatality rates now are down to 0.18%, and obviously lower than that on the flat. Compare that though with the Grand National. Again, refer you to my earlier theme, our biggest platform for the public, 1.6% against 0.2% for racing overall. So that's the dichotomy that we're dealing with here in terms of how we deal with and how we evolve this race. And that flows into some of the public perception issues that people have got about the Grand National. Admittedly, at a very, very sensitive period, just after the 2023 running, and we all know how that race panned out, and we all know the issues and the challenges we were dealing with, both on the ground and in the public airwaves after that. We did a statistically significant, I think that's the right phrase, survey of UK adults, which gave us some pretty startling outputs, which you can see for yourself there. 32% of UK adults, and skewed higher in younger generations, by the way, feel that horse racing is cruel to horses. 85% of those surveyed felt that horse racing wasn't a sport for someone like them. Now, we all know in this room how open and inclusive and diverse this sport is and is becoming and is moving forward on. But this says to me that there's so much more we still need to do in terms of cut through. And when we make changes like this, that what we're talking about for the Grand National, that's the sort of thing that needs to cut through to show we care, to show that we're having a positive impact on the world around us, to show that we care for our equine athletes, and to really start to frame those messages for the wider public. Because we know we've got a great story to tell, but the rest of the world doesn't know that. And certainly when I talk in public, I feel that equine welfare and the changes we've made and the progress we've made is one of the areas where I feel on actually very steady ground. There are others where I feel actually less steady, but this is one where I genuinely feel we've got a really good story to tell. But that's what we're up against. And the issues around gambling and elitism, which are not relevant to today's session, but those are the other perception issues that we have got. They are perception issues. We are changing, we are evolving as a sport, of course we are, but we've got work to do to change those perceptions. Looking specifically at the concerns around welfare, and again, I'm not going to go through every bar in this chart, but just look on the left-hand side there. 28% are very concerned about horse welfare in racing. 14% aren't really that concerned at all. The battleground, if you will, is that group in the middle. It adds up to 56% on this survey. 56% of the public are there to be persuaded. They want to engage with the sport. They want to know we're doing everything we humanly can to make this sport safer. We have that independent critical friend from the veterinary organisations and other welfare organisations that we engage with. World Horse Welfare, we'll hear from Rolly later on, RSPCA and others. And we should be welcoming those people in. Again, back to one of Bob's key themes. And if we're going to do that, we're talking to this 56% persuadable group in the middle. I see this as an opportunity. I see this as saying the majority of the public, some are there already, but the majority want to engage with us and want to know we're doing everything we can. Certainly there was a conception that with these changes, and Rishi alluded to it in his presentation, obviously they got a mixed reception from some. Oh, you're giving in to the antis, you're basically, it's the thin end of the wedge, it's the end of jumps racing, as we know it, and all this sort of stuff. The reality is that the antis, people who want to stop horse racing, are not our core target market here. It's that persuadable group in the middle. That's the people we're having the conversation with, and that's the people who want to see the proof points. And that goes to not just the Grand National, but racing in general, how judicious use of the whip, size of the fences, all of those, quality of the ground, all of those sorts of things. That's what people want reassurance on. So those are the areas where our focus was when we thought about the changes to this race and the gradual evolution of this race. One final bit of stats before I move on. Perceptions have worsened as well. Even in an era of between 2013 and I think 2019, not a single fatality in the Grand National following the 2012-13 changes that I'll come to in a second. If I get my maths right here, 39% in 2010 thought the Grand National was fairly cruel or very cruel. By 2023, and I admit an inflection point given the events of 2023, that number had increased to 54%. And you can see the same trend on the decline on the other side of the curve. And I won't bore you with that bottom table there, but that certainly says that young people feel even more stronger on those particular metrics than the overall population. So if this sport is to be sustainable into the long term, and back to Tansi's generational point, it makes evolving the race, changing these things even more resonant. Now, I've talked quite a lot about evolution, and that's very much how we see these changes. Yes, what we did for the 24 renewal was definitely more maybe eye-catching, perhaps, than what we've done in the past. I think the last set of really eye-catching changes probably took place in 2012 into 2013. It's actually not on there, but we actually moved the start that year as well. To move, if people remember, the start used to be much further up towards the Sefton and Lord Derby stands. It moved it up, I think, about 80 yards down towards the Melling Road, just to get them away from the excitement of the crowd, to calm them down, and obviously at that point, to have a lower speed into the first fence as well. I'll come back to speed in a minute. The other thing we did at that point as well, which I think made a real difference, was we changed all the underlying timbers into easy fix tubs underneath the birch fences. Again, lots of mixed reception to that. It's not the same race, you're dumbing it down, all of this sort of stuff, but I bring you back to society's expectations and the need to evolve with society's expectations, because without those changes at that point, I think there'd been 2 or 3 fatalities in 2012, including that year's Gold Cup winner. I would contend that without those changes, the race would be in a very different place over that 10, 12-year period to what it is now. But the evolution since has had to be significant. The other thing I would throw in that wasn't as noticeable, because it's not as public, is the changes we've made over time to the veterinary checks. James is here. James's team at the BHA, independent vets, independent panels, have increased in relevance, increased in the extent to which we consult them, and the veterinary checks we now have around trot-ups, videos being sent in well before entry stage, monitoring of horses almost through the year in terms of assessing their suitability to run, are bigger and more stringent than they've ever been. And we've introduced those for the Topham and the Fox Hunters races as well over the same fences. So that is something that's less noticeable, but just as impactful. And thanks to James for everything he and his team have done to help us with that, and also to Rowley and World Horse Welfare for the advice they've given us on that, because those changes, whilst much less noticeable, are potentially just as impactful. So you can see that this is part of an evolutionary process for this race, and we've done this based on, yes, consultation, but also data, analytics, and really deep sort of thinking on what drives accidents and what we can do to reduce accidents and indeed FUBs and fatalities. This is not my friend, is it? Just a few more proof points before I get into the specifics. This is what my GCSE maths teacher would call a line of best fit. Lovely lady, by the way. She died recently, unfortunately, but I mean, this stuff is really, really resonant for us. This is really just the top end. We're looking at the runners that fell, the brought down. You can see the trend there. Now, clearly, there are going to be outliers in any given years. We know what 24 looks like because that was well publicised at the time. And the one thing I would say is, whilst the changes for 24 that I'm about to talk about have clearly impacted, I think it is way too early to say that this has all worked and we can expect similar outcomes in 25 and beyond to what we saw in 24. But certainly we're very pleased with some very judicious riding of the race from the jockeys, I have to say. 24 shows that the best set of outcomes we've seen for a very long time. And you can see the percentage of completion there is higher than it's been, going back to, I think you have to go back to 1992, which is the year I left school, so that's quite a long time ago, to find a higher percentage of finishers. So definitely, a promising outcome from the changes we made, but much, much too early to say that, this has all worked. You've got to go on more than 1 year's stats based on that. So into the specifics themselves then. So we, as I mentioned earlier, do a lot of independent consultation work, a lot of data analysis. Simon Rowlands wrote a report after the 2022 running on speeds and how to win the national and how to ride the national judiciously, and that gave us a lot of really good and analytical data around speeds into the first fence, between the first fence and beachers. I'll come back to that in a second. We also relied on a lot of independent data, jump race risk model, and my particular favourite, which is a 2002 report, which is called The Risk Factors and Sources of Variation in Horsefalls in Steeplechase Racing in the UK. Not a catchy title, I'll accept. Probably not a bestseller, but never mind that. A really fundamental tome of work in that case, and actually proving a clear link, which I think intuitively we'd all agree with, between the number of runners in a big field steeplechase and the likelihood of accidents. I think intuitively we'd all agree that with the impact of potential obstructions and accidents that can happen, the more horses there are, especially over those big fences, the more likely you are to see an accident. Well, that work, despite the title, statistically proved that, and that was certainly something that was high in our consideration set when we set out on this work, and with Suleika and Richard and the team started to really look into the analysis of it. So there were then 4 or 5, I would say, key themes around the actual changes themselves, and speed is one of them, and you can see the impacts there in the 35, 47 years between 65 and 2012. The average speed between beachers and the first fence and beachers, 0.9 seconds down. Doesn't sound a lot, but it's actually about 4 lengths. That, by the way, that slower time is despite the course record being set in that period, 1990. The jockey is in the room, so I'm going to just mention that because that's despite Mr. Frisk's time being in there. Probably one of those sporting records, along with Jim Laker's 19 wickets at Old Trafford in 1956, that will probably never be beaten, given how we're now running this race. But speed was a key consideration, both into the first fence and beyond into beachers. And of course, the big reason for that was because there are better horses running in this race. There are more top-end staying chasers who are taking their chance in this race because of the prize money, because of the prestige, taking their chance off a big weight. And that is meaning that the horses are going faster. The lowering of the fences, And the flattening of the leveling of the landing areas also has an impact. An unintended consequence of that is actually that it's also speeded them up. The other one I would give you is ground. We thought a lot about, we want good to soft ground. Suleika is going to talk a bit about that in the video in a second. And being clear that that was something we needed to address. That was one of the things that drove the change behind the change of day and less time for the ground to dry out. And I've already talked about the veterinary checks and all the impacts and all the thinking around that. So those were really the big themes we started to think about when we started thinking about what we need to change, along with the field size, which I've already talked about. So where did that leave us then, in terms of the changes we actually made? The ones that are more eye-catching are in red. Hopefully, some of the things I've talked about already support the move, slowing them down, especially slowing them down into that first fence, reducing the chances of bumping and obstruction in the first few fences. 40 to 34, we felt was the right place to pitch it whilst maintaining the race's uniqueness. And the earlier start time. Less time for there to be ground drying out. We have seen lots of good weather in Liverpool recently on Grand National Day, believe it or not. And that means that the ground dries out quicker, and there's probably been some times, we can't irrigate during the day, so there's probably been some times where we've actually been starting on good ground, which is not ideal. And then the pressure point around the racecourse as well. So I'm just going to show you a very brief video now that talks about these changes and the specifics of them by a few people who are, putting it mildly, a bit more expert than me.
We know that good soft ground is optimal for jump racing, and research has shown that. And as a result, we always aim to produce good soft ground for the Grand National.
Even in April, if it's a relatively sunny day, if there's a bit of a breeze, the ground will dry out quite considerably. And we don't want the ground to become too hard, because we know that becomes more risky for the horses. By moving to that earlier part of the day, it allows the racecourse to be in optimal condition at the time of the race. We also looked at the number of runners in the race, the number of horses that are competing in the race, and we know that for every additional horse that runs in the race, there is a slightly increased chance of each horse falling at an individual fence.
When looking at this, we looked at lower numbers, but there was a concern that if we reduce the field size too far, we're going to create a faster and effectively more dangerous race. 34 runners maintain the balance between a safer race and a competitive race. Having discussed the start with the BHA starting team, course inspectorate, some past and present jockeys, the decision was made that a standing start would be introduced for all races over the Grand National fences.
Because with a rolling start, people weren't using the full width of the track anymore because they didn't need to line up wide. So it became much tighter, much narrower, and more of the horses were racing to the first fence on the inside third of the track. So a standing start will create an automatic spread on the field. That'll give more room going to the first fence, and by width and coming from a standing start, hopefully it'll create less speed.
Data analysis by Aintree Racecourse has demonstrated that horses are approaching that first fence faster than ever before, and we know that this makes it more dangerous for them when jumping. So by reducing that distance between the first fence and the start, it means that horses can't build up the speed that they would have done previously.
I think it's an evolution. No, nobody likes change, but unfortunately the world is changing and every sport has changed, and racing has to change too, and we have to be prepared to evolve if we're going to ensure the safety of the Grand National.
A bit of a flavour from some advocates and experts, and Suleika obviously led this work as clerk at Aintree, but she was supported by, as I said, a significant number of people, industry stakeholders, vets, and other statistical experts around what drives risk. And I believe the changes they came up with were balanced, judicious, and definitely needed for the protection and the evolution of this race. So that then took us on to, once we'd agreed the changes, once we'd had them signed off by the BHA veterinary team, the BHA board, and indeed our own board. And as you can imagine, lots of debate around those, because not everyone's going to support everything, and we knew there'd be a mixed reaction to some of it because of some of the themes I mentioned earlier on about devaluing the race, dumbing the race down. But we were very clear with a number of objectives around the media announcement. One, it needed to be framed in the context of our wider commitment to equine welfare. Two, it needed to have some independent validation, which is where we were very grateful to get some of stakeholders from outside racing on board, including World Horse Welfare, RSPCA and others, and that was really important for us. Three, I think it was really important to have some industry stakeholders who were clearly in support of it and developing content like you've just seen to be able to explain the thinking and the reasoning and putting that in the context of the evolution of this race, a theme I've talked about a lot today. And I think the other thing for us as well, it was really important to show that we weren't marking our own homework. Back to this point about independent validation of what we were doing. And then most of all, it was our job to get out there and really talk about this in terms of racing's commitment and our commitment to welfare. And of course, that got lots of coverage. It cut through into the mainstream sports media. The day we announced it, actually, there was something much bigger and far more important in the world that happened, because it was the day that the situation in Lebanon and Israel became very serious this time last year, and obviously we're still living with the consequences of that. But that did rather put things in perspective, but it was really important for us to be able to make sure these messages were cutting through. And I believe we did that. It was always going to be the rich tapestry of debate that we're used to in this industry. It's not North Korea, so everybody really felt they could have a say on it, and that's fine, because not everyone's going to agree with everything. But we felt, based on our judgment as guardians of this race and passing it on to the next generation in a better state in which we found it, that we felt it was well balanced. And most of the headlines we got, some negative stuff on the bottom left there, but really important to land those messages and make sure that cut through. And then, of course, during the period of the race itself, and given what we did see on the day and the high no fallers and the higher finish rate that I showed you earlier, that was a really positive proof point for us to rely on. And Dick and White was quite rightly quoted very positively around that, and that really cut through. And our polling afterwards showed us that people had seen that, taken that on board. But it's the start of a big journey. It's a continuation of a big journey, I should say. It's never done, but it's a race that we should all be extremely proud of. It's a race that is the platform, is the main shop window of our sport, and it's a race that we need to preserve and protect, but it's also a race that we need to maintain its acceptability to society, because it is one of racing's, indeed Britain's, biggest sporting assets, and our job is to preserve it, look after it, evolve it, and improve it. I'm going to finish with another video. We had a fantastic day in April, and I'm hoping, and I know there'll be another one to come in 2025. So thank you very much.
And they're off. Action underway here at Aintree 2024. Another Grade 1 win for Nico de Boinville. Sir Gino has won the anniversary hurdle.
Jerry Colomb has won the William Hill Bowl Chase.
Oh, it's tight in a classic for the William Hill Aintree Hurdle.
I just love Ladies Day at the Grand National so much. Today is just the perfect chance to go all out and really go for it.
And they're off. The Trusted Trader Top Novices Hurdle.
Mystical Power over, about a length clear of Firefox, and Mystical Power holds on to confirm the supreme form and win the Top Novice.
The final fence, John Ball picks up just ahead of Conflated, who's trying to fight back on the run for home, and up towards the line, John Ball wins again at Aintree.
And they're off and racing in the Randox Grand National of 2024. Kitty's Light is in fourth. Manila Indo is pressed and passed by Ian Maximus, who starts to storm clear inside the last half furlong. And Ian Maximus and Paul Townend streaking away to win the Randox Grand National. Ian Maximus the winner.
I even managed to stick to time, which
incredible.
is rare for me.
That's incredible.
Rhea and I had a debate earlier. She said to me this morning, "Have you timed your presentation, Nevin?" I said, "No." I was practicing it in front of the Champions League matches last night, but I didn't quite get that. Anyway.
A+ for timing, for sure. Just a couple of questions, and of course, again, Nevin will be hosting a table at lunch, so if anyone has questions for him, then please feel free to pose them to him then. The couple of questions I have for you, Nevin, is, first of all, and you heard Bob talking about it earlier about collaboration, and you mentioned naysayers, and I said it in the lead up to introducing you. How did that challenge, how did you overcome dealing with those people? Did you have to say, right, I know there'll be people who will be negative, so we are just going to press on because we are doing the right thing?
Yes, so in the end, you've got, when you're doing the jobs that we do, and you're doing the job that Seleka in particular does, it is down to the reason you're in that role is because it's down to your judgment as to what's right and where the balance lies, because we all know there's a balance here, as I said in the presentation, between evolving the race to keep it, evolving with society, but also to keep it unique, and that's the balance we've got. So we always knew that there were going to be some people who didn't agree with us, and so a lot of the people we spoke to behind the scenes ahead of when we were consulting didn't agree with everything we did. But ultimately, you've got to work out a way of how you navigate through that, knowing there's going to be people who disagree with you, but trusting your own judgment to say this is the right balance. And I believe we did that, but we were ready for lots of mixed debate and coverage, and of course that's what we got. But ultimately, if we're going to sustain this sport into the future, this is the killer argument for me. If this sport's going to sustain itself into the future, then we've got to change, we've got to evolve, we've got to do that at pace.
And do you have to change and evolve, like we heard again from Bob, before we get to a crisis level? So obviously 2023 was a huge moment for the Grand National. And that, a lot of people will see as had the result of all the changes that have come subsequently. So in order to prevent something like 2023 happening again, are you confident of a process and a program that's going to be ahead of that curve and avoid crisis?
I don't think you can ever be completely confident that that sort of thing won't happen again, because that's out of our hands, how people choose to react, what people choose to do. It's interesting, we've not heard anything from Animal Rising now for over a year, but it's about being on the left-hand side of Bob's curve, isn't it? It's about being able to talk positively about the changes we have made. You will never eliminate risk from this sport, we know that, but I think as long as we can show that we're doing everything we can to minimise that risk, then we have a good story to tell, and it doesn't really matter what others intend to do, because it's difficult to engage with people who want to stop your sport. It's much easier to engage with people who want you to evolve, and as Bob said, want you to be better, and we just need to keep getting better.
Nevin, thank you very much.
Thanks, Richie.